Hey folks, sort of close to the end of our year. We're going to do today and we'll have tomorrow as well. Um, Essentially, we're going to be looking at two poems this week. We're still in our Victorian poetry unit. I'm trying to show you a diversity of poems so that you can get an idea of what various types look like. This poem is called Ulysses. It's by a guy named Alfred Lord Tennyson, the most famous poet, hands down, of the Victorian age in England. So, as usual, what I want to do is I want to open this up by reading the poem out loud. Uh, so that you can listen to it. And then we're going to do the kinds of things that we usually do. We're going to look at the title, we're going to look at the author. We're going to take a look at literary devices and sound devices and things like that. And then after we've gone through some of these things and taken a look at them, we'll read the whole poem again and make sure that we go through line by line and analyze it so that you can understand it and appreciate it. So, start out with a reading. Ulysses by Alfred Lord Tennyson. It little profits that an idle king, by this still hearth, among these barren crags, matched with this aged wife, I meet and dole unequal laws unto a savage race that hoard and sleep and feed and know not me. I cannot rest from travel. I will drink life to the lees. All the times I have enjoyed greatly, have suffered greatly, both with those that loved me and alone on shore. And when through the scudding drifts the rainy Hyades vex the dim sea, I am become a name, for always roaming with a hungry heart. Much have I seen and known, cities of men and manners, climates, councils, governments, myself not least, but honored of them all, and drunk delight of battle with my peers, far on the ringing plains of windy Troy. I am part of all that I have met. Yet all experience is an arch wherethrough gleams that untraveled world whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. How dull it is to pause, to make an end, to rust unburnished, not to shine in use, as though to breathe were life. Life piled on life were all too little, and of one to me little remains. But every hour is saved from that eternal silence, something more, a bringer of new things. And vile it were for some 3 suns to store and hoard myself, and this gray spirit yearning in desire to follow knowledge like a sinking star, beyond the utmost bound of human thought. This is my son, mine own Telemachus, to whom I leave the scepter and the isle, well loved of me, discerning to fulfill this labor by slow prudence to make mild a rugged people, and through soft degrees subdue them to the useful and the good. Most blameless is he, centered in the sphere of common duties, decent not to fail in offices of tenderness, and pay meet adoration to my household gods. When I am gone, he works his work, and I mine. There lies the port. The vessel puffs her sail. There gloom the dark, broad seas. My mariners, souls that have toiled and wrought and thought with me, that ever with a frolic welcome took the thunder and the sunshine and opposed free hearts, free foreheads. You and I are old. Old age has yet his honor and his toil. Death closes all, but something ere the end. Some work of noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming men that strove with gods. The lights begin to twinkle from the rocks. The long day wanes. The slow moon climbs. The deep moans round with many voices. Come, my friends, it is not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows, for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that gulfs will wash us down. It may be that we will touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. It's a great poem. But what's going on here? You just read the Odyssey with me, so you probably picked up some interesting things. Wait, the ringing plains of windy Troy. Wait, Telemachus. These are names that are familiar. If something's going on here, what is this poem? What's going on? So, uh, I think we'll start with the background that you need to know. You see that this thing is called Ulysses, and you're like, well, who is Ulysses? What's going on with that? Let's take a look, shall we? I bet Wikipedia is going to give us Ulysses S. Grant, but let's see if it gives us somebody else. Um, Oh, it's giving us the stories. Ulysses Wikipedia. That's a story by James Joyce. Oh, it was a tough story. Ulysses. Oh, wait, Odysseus? Why is Odysseus coming up here? It turns out that if you clicked on Odysseus, Ulysses is the Roman name in Latin right here for Odysseus. And so this story is really titled Odysseus. It's just that Tennyson used the Roman name instead of the Greek name. Now, remember back when we were doing the mythology unit and we looked at Greek names versus Roman names were in circulation through Europe throughout the Middle Ages and throughout the Victorian period. It's not until more modern translations happened that they started going back to the actual Greek names. And so Ulysses would have been the far more common, the far more well known name for Odysseus during the time in which Tennyson wrote this poem. So it's essentially called Odysseus. So that changes our view a little bit. So this is a poem about Odysseus himself. And as we read the poem, it's a poem about Odysseus after the end of the Odyssey. So what Tennyson does here is he gives us a story of the ending of Odysseus's life, how he imagines Odysseus's story would end. He felt unsatisfied with the end of the Odyssey, and no wonder. I mean, to be honest with you, it just sort of ends, and there's no satisfactory resolution about what happens with Odysseus or Penelope or Telemachus or any of that. And a number of authors and a number of poets have offered their idea of the ending of the story, and this is one of them. Tennyson loved mythology. He wrote a number of poems about Greek myth. He also wrote a number of poems about King Arthur myths, England's mythological backstory of the Arthurian romance. And so he was always interested in mythology, and this is his end of the Odyssey story. Now he is inspired, and we'll talk about his inspirations as we go through the story itself. But he was inspired primarily, I think, in this one by a guy named Dante, who wrote a story called the Inferno. And in the Inferno, Dante takes a trip through Christian hell and meets various people down there in hell. And one of the people he meets in hell is Odysseus. And he asks Odysseus how he dies, and Odysseus tells a story of his death. And this poem sort of uses that idea of Odysseus's death as sort of a jumping point to tell its story. So in the Inferno, do I have the Inferno open here? Yeah, in the Inferno by Dante, which was a medieval story, a religious medieval story about a guy named Dante who took a trip through hell. In this story, Odysseus died at sea. The story goes, at least what he tells Dante when they meet in hell, is that he got on a ship with a bunch of older sailors, and they decided that they were going to go on an exploratory voyage. I guess Dante was not happy with the idea that Odysseus, who had done all of these things and had all these adventures, could just sit at home for the rest of his life and not be a hero anymore. Even though we looked at the class at how Odysseus's character arc showed him becoming more humble and realizing the importance of family and only wanting to be content. Dante seems to suggest that Odysseus would not have been able to be content in his regular life and would have wanted to go out exploring. And so he decides in Dante's story to try and sail west past the setting sun. And so he sails off in his Greek ship into the Atlantic Ocean, and he sees this giant mountain in the distance, and in Dante's version, that mountain is the mountain of purgatory. It sort of symbolizes earthly wisdom and the heights that you can attain to without faith or religion or something like that. We don't need to go into all that. But whatever the case, Odysseus sails off towards this place, but he gets sucked into a whirlpool and drowns. And that's the death of Odysseus, is the death Dante gives him. And that's sort of what happens in this poem as well. So when we get back to Ulysses, I think that Tennyson is depending on you to have read Inferno and to know a little bit about what happens to Odysseus. There are other stories, actually, of how Odysseus dies and the end of Odysseus's life. And maybe now's as good a time as any to talk about some of them, because it's kind of fun. So if you recall, one of the tasks that Odysseus was given when he returned to Ithaca was he was to make peace with Poseidon. He was going to walk inland with an oar on his shoulder until some guy didn't know what the oar was. And then he would have to plant the oar in the ground and make sacrifices to Poseidon. Well, in some versions of Odysseus's death or end of life, he plants his oar in this place, and then he decides he's going to live there. And so he leaves Ithaca under the command of Telemachus, and that's sort of alluded to in this poem. And he and Penelope go off and live far away from the ocean because he's had enough. And I can understand that. So that's one interesting story of Odysseus. Another interesting story of Odysseus is that he again left Ithaca under the command of Telemachus, and he and Penelope went off and founded a new city. And the legendary location of this new city that was founded by Odysseus is a city in Portugal called Lisbon. It's called Lisbon because it used to be. I'm trying to remember what the Ulysses. Let me look it up. I was remembering that right. So Greek legend tells of Ulysses as the founder of Lisbon, Portugal, calling it Ulyssipo or Ulyssia. You can see it, Ulyss. It's got the same sound in it, kind of like Alexandria and like all the various cities around that are named after Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar or whatever. This one is pretty cool because Ulysses and Lisbon are sort of connected. So an interesting alternate ending of Odysseus' story is that he and Penelope go off and found this city, which is now the capital of Portugal, and that's kind of a fun one. Anyway, let's get back to our poem. I've got to shift my screen over again. All right. Back over there. So that gives us something to look at with the title. This is an alternate ending to the story of Odysseus from the Odyssey. Let's take a second and look at our poet, because it's always useful to you to know something about your poet. This is Alfred Lord Tennyson, really, really famous Victorian poet. He became incredibly famous during the Victorian age because he was the favorite poet of Queen Victoria. In fact, he was such a good poet, or Queen Victoria liked his poetry so much that she made him a lord. You can see that his name was just Alfred Tennyson, but she made him a lord. Now, it wasn't a lord that he could pass down to his children. It was a lord for the rest of his life. So he ended up being a baron and having a castle and was able to live in it, and he became the national poet of England. And the reason is just good timing on Tennyson's part. Tennyson, growing up, was a member of a large family. He had lots of brothers and sisters. His dad was a pastor, an Anglican pastor, and so he's related to the church. He has lots of allusions to the Bible in his writing as a result of this. But he was drawn to poetry relatively young. Even at age 17, he published a book of poetry sort of locally, and he went to Cambridge and was studying poetry at Cambridge College. And it just so happened that his best friend right out of Cambridge, a guy named Arthur Henry Hallam, had a freak stroke and died at age 22. And this sort of broke Tennyson as a human being. And so he wrote a series of poems called In Memoriam AHH. The AHH is for his friend's initials, Arthur Henry Hallam. And it was a series of sort of laments or elegies, sad poems dedicated to the death of his friend. And this was published just about the same time that Queen Victoria's husband died. And so Queen Victoria took a lot of solace in reading Tennyson's elegies to his dead friend because they helped her deal with the death of her husband. And so she elevated Tennyson because of this, and when the Queen's talking about how great your poetry is, then everybody wants to read it, and he sort of skyrocketed into popularity and became this central figure. In fact, the second most widely published book in England during the Victorian age was Tennyson's book of poetry. The most widely published was the Bible, and most houses could be counted on to have both in them. So anyway, he became the national poet of England, and I guess that gives you enough to go on. He lived a long life as a very famous author. So now we know a little bit about the title. We know a little bit about the author. Let's take a look at some of the things that we looked at previously. One of the things that we were looking at previously was rhyme scheme, and you may have noticed during a first read that this doesn't seem to have one, right? Let me pause this, copy and paste this, and put it into a document so we can work with it. There we go. Rhyme scheme. Let's take a look. King, that's always going to be A, right? Anything that rhymes with that is going to also be A. Crags does not rhyme with king, so it's B. Dole, that's brand new. That's C. Race, that's brand new. That's D. Me, nope, that's E. Drink, nope, that's F. Enjoy, nope, that's G. Wait, there's no rhyme scheme at all here, right? Like these are all different words and they don't rhyme in any meaningful way. Is it a poem if it doesn't rhyme? Well, that's a good question. Turns out it is. I mean, you can see it's clearly written in stanzas. These lines don't go all the way across the entire page like they would in a regular paragraph. It's written in this sort of stanza way. It doesn't just keep going as one giant monologue. It tells a story. So there's that. But what makes it a poem? Why is it a poem even though it doesn't rhyme? Well, one way that you can check to see the intent behind something like this is you can count the syllables. Look at how the lines are relatively uniform in length. That means we probably have what's called a meter, right? Like the meter has to do with the syllable count. So let's count the syllables in the lines and see if we got something going on here. It little profits that an idle king. That's 10. By this still hearth among these barren crags. That's 10. Matched with an aged wife I meet and dole. That's 10. Unequal laws unto a savage race that hoard and sleep and feed and know not me. I cannot rest from travel, I will drink. See what's going on here? This is what's called blank verse. Let me add that to our list of poetry terms. It's another type of poem. It's a poem that, let's see if we can find where I put ballad. Okay, yeah, we'll put. So blank verse is a type of poetry that is written in unrhymed lines of iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is something that you'll be familiar with after you read Shakespeare and sonnets, and it's the most common what we call meter in the English language, and you could sort of hear the rhythm of it when I was reading those lines. But basically, penta means 5, and an iamb is a particular arrangement of syllables. So if you look here, an iamb is an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. So that is what an iamb is. So it's a 2-syllable pairing. And I'm not going to force you to learn this at the end of the year, but I guess it's worth knowing. So it's an unstressed and a stressed syllable. And so what you end up doing is to make pentameter, you need 5 of these groups of unstressed and stressed syllables. So you have unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, and it goes through, and you end up with these 5, and you can sort of hear it. It little profits that an idle king, right? You can hear how it flip-flops back and forth. By this still hearth among these barren crags. You can hear the meter. But what it ultimately comes down to is that if an iamb is 2 syllables and there's 5 iambs in a line, your lines are always going to be 10 syllables. So if you can count syllables and you can look at the lines and you can count them through, you can identify iambic pentameter. Almost any line of poetry that is going to be 10 syllables long, repeated down the poem, probably that poem is in iambic pentameter. So just count the syllables, and if it's repeated 10s, you're probably in iambic pentameter. That means this poem is written in what's called blank verse. It's unrhymed lines of iambic pentameter. So there's that. Other things that are interesting about this poem. Let's take a look at sound devices. Let me pause it and go through and see if we can identify sound devices. My hunch is that there's not a lot here. I wasn't noticing a ton of sound devices either. Nope, should have known better. Tennyson's a professional. He does a lot of good sound devices here, especially with assonance. You can hear it. It little profits that an idle king. Can you hear it? It'll profits, and then I and ing. It's the same I sound here in the second one as it, and well, we got 2 different I sounds. We got the and the I here, and then again this still. Same sound there. And then these and crags both have consonants together. And then we got with and wife here. We got an aged, and then we got wife, I, and I. going on there. Unequal laws unto a savage race. Can you hear it? A savage race. Like a lot of A sounds there. Then we've got some consonants here. Horde, and. Lots of repetition of this and here, but it brings the D's all together. We've also got sleep, feed, and me, all of which have a hard E sound. So that's assonance. And no and not, even though they're spelled differently, they both start with an N sound. So there's alliteration there as well. We got consonants in this next line, cannot, rest. And then we got travel and will is another example of consonants. Oops, and I skipped this I. I meant to highlight that. We got I and ink, like they have the same I sound. In this line, we got life and lees. That's alliteration. Life, though, has a hard I sound. So does times, and so does I. So we got 3 of those going on there. And then you can see down here, greatly is a hard E sound, and we have a repetition of greatly there. So anyway, we got plenty of sound devices going on in here. We can go through the whole thing and identify them all. But what's important is that you can identify them when the time comes, because they create a flow, and especially in a poem that is in blank verse, it doesn't have the flow of rhymes. You need to have other ways to make the verse memorable, to make it flow for your readers, and this is how Tennyson does that. Other things that we should look at. This is a story. So as a story, let's take a look at the narrator. We just read the Ballad of Reading Gaol by Oscar Wilde, and we knew that the narrator of that was Oscar Wilde himself. Well, this poem's called Ulysses, and so it's actually going to be narrated by Ulysses. You can see this. It's in the first person. We've got I here. A little profits of an idle king by this still hearth among these barren crags, matched with an aged wife. I meet in dole and equal laws unto a savage race. So this is told from Ulysses or Odysseus's perspective. He is the narrator of the story. And it is in the present tense. I cannot rest from travel. I will drink life to the lees. So he's in the present tense, though he does tend to reminisce a little bit about earlier parts of his life as well. So we've got a first-person present tense narrator here. And this is appropriate because Odysseus also narrated some of his own story in Homer. So we're jumping into that voice. I suppose I should read it in my Odysseus voice. No, I won't do that to you. Yeah, little prophets and an idle king. By this still hearth, I just did it anyway. Among these barren crags, matched with an aged wife, I meet and dole unequal laws unto a savage race that hoard and sleep and feed and no, not me. I'm not going to read the whole thing that way, but that was my Odysseus voice from the Odyssey lectures. If you want to read the Odyssey lectures again, you're welcome to. But anyway, it's told from his perspective. So we have this narrative perspective that I think is worth keeping in mind as well to help us understand what's going on. So now that we've got some of that stuff out of the way, we know what type of a poem it is. We know that it's a retelling of the story of Odysseus's death, or a reimagining of the story of Odysseus's death. That Tennyson was not content with Odysseus, I guess, wasting away and becoming old in Ithaca and living a life with his family. He didn't feel like that was an accurate representation of Odysseus's character, so he decided to write an alternate ending for him. So let's read it, and let's translate it and make sure that we understand from beginning to end what's going on. There's a lot of tough language here that we're going to stop and look up. I don't know that we can look up all of it because there's a lot of it, and I'll try and summarize things that you need to know. So it little profits that an idle king, idle in this case means without anything to do. So Odysseus here is idle. He's sitting, like he's a guy who's been at sea or at the Trojan War for the last 20 years, always busy, always with some challenge facing him, and now he's like sitting at home, like in his rocking chair on his porch, bored. Right. So little profits that an idle king by this still hearth, like there's nothing going on in this house, it's still. Among these barren crags, Ithaca is a rocky land. We've talked about this a lot of times. Odysseus is always mentioning rocky Ithaca. Matched with an aged wife. This is kind of unfair. Like he suddenly realized that Penelope's old like he is. I meet and dole. To dole out is to hand out. I imagine meet means the same thing, but we'll look it up just, because we can. So let's jump over here. To dispense or allot justice, a punishment or harsh treatment. So Odysseus, you can sort of picture what we've got going on here. Oopsie, it's not what I wanted. Odysseus is meeting and doling out laws to a savage race. Remember that he has been everywhere. He's been to Egypt, he's been to Troy, he's been to Crete, he's been to Athens, he's been to Sparta. Compared to all of these places, Ithaca is a small backwards island, very rural, very the opposite of cosmopolitan. And, so this idea that they're a savage race, that these people in Ithaca are uncultured, and Odysseus is incredibly cultured as a world traveler. He feels a gap, he feels a difference between himself and the average people of Ithaca. And he's here supposed to be, what's he doing? He's sitting in his castle, and people are like, "This man built his fence on my land," and so like he's having to deal like this guy stole one of my sheep. Like he's a guy who listened to the sirens. He's a guy who came up with a Trojan horse, and he's going to spend the rest of his career like listening to trials about stupid, pointless agricultural matters, right? So he looks at the people of Ithaca. They hoard and they sleep and they feed and they know not me. And this is also important. Odysseus has changed. When he left Ithaca 20 years ago, he was the king. He knew the place. He knew the people. And now that he's come back, everybody he knows is dead, or the majority of them. And so he's come back sort of a stranger to his homeland and is trying to find his place there again. Then he says, I cannot rest from travel. And that's an interesting line, because Odysseus has been traveling his entire life, well, for the last 20 years, and to stop is so strange to him. You can imagine that he's used to having the sway of a ship deck under his feet and all of these kinds of things. And the following line is, I will drink life to the lees. So this word lees is an interesting word that we're going to want to look up as well. I know what it means. It's like the dregs or the bottom of a thing of wine, but the sediment of wine in the barrel. So nowadays, when they make wine, you go to the grocery store and you look at wine on the shelf. The whole bottle is perfect because it's filtered very well. Back in the day, they didn't have the filtration systems that they have now, and people used to literally step on the grapes and crunch them up, and that was how wine was made. And so inevitably, in every barrel or every bottle of wine, there was a stuff called lees. It's kind of like you ever buy the orange juice that has pulp, and hold on one second. You don't shake the orange juice bottle, the pulp all filters down to the bottom. That's the lees. That's like the garbage bit at the bottom. And so this is a metaphor. Life doesn't have lees. Life doesn't have pulp. But if Odysseus's life was a bottle of orange juice, if you will, he's drank it all down to like the pulp, and that's all that's left. The remainder of his life is that nasty. Imagine if you bought a high pulp orange juice and you never shook it, and you drank it all, and then you had to drink the pulp at the end. That's the lees. So he's determined to drink even the lees. He's determined to live the entirety of his life. And so he says, I will drink life to the lees. I'm going to drink it all, the entire barrel of wine that is my life. And then he says, all times I have enjoyed greatly, have suffered greatly. So there's an interesting and almost paradoxical idea here that in retrospect, the things that we most value in our lives are the things that are full of suffering, that are difficult and hard to manage. And I think this is a useful life lesson for those of us that are in school right now. The things that we value in retrospect are the things that are hard. You're proud of yourself when you've overcome a difficult situation, as opposed to when things are easy and then you never develop an appreciation for that thing. So again, I've said this, I don't know how many times, appreciate the hard moments in your life, because that's when you're learning, that's when you're growing, that's when you're developing, and that's what you're going to value later. And Odysseus is starting to come to this realization. All the times I have enjoyed greatly, have suffered greatly, both with those that love me and alone on shore. And when through scudding drifts the rainy Hyades, that's obviously an allusion to something Greek, but let's find out, shall we? Always a good idea to look up your allusions. An open star cluster in the constellation Taurus, appearing to surround the bright star Aldebaran. That's a great name. So he's talking about a constellation here. And when through scudding drifts the rainy Hyades vex the dim sea. Vex means to bother or to upset. Then he says, I am become a name for always roaming with a hungry heart. This is true. If somebody goes on an odyssey, it means a long, dangerous journey. So his name itself has become a word that we use for a long roaming journey, to be on an odyssey. Um, he then continues, he says, much have I seen and known. He's thinking back all about his life. Cities of men and manners, climates, councils, governments. This is a list of all the things that Odysseus himself has observed in life. Uh, Myself not least, but honored of them all. And he's been honored everywhere he went. People have treated him with respect. People look at him, and maybe there's an implied contrast between all of these other countries where he is honored, and now he's in Ithaca where the people don't even know him and maybe chafe under his rulership. We got a taste of that at the end of the Odyssey when Antinous' dad is like, Odysseus left with the best of our men and none of them came back, right? And so I think there's probably some animosity even regarding Odysseus returning so late from the Trojan War with none of the soldiers that he left and was trying to protect. Uh, where was I? Myself not least, but honored of them all, and drunk delight of battle with my peers far on the ringing plains of windy Troy. I love that line. There's such imagery there. You can see the ringing plains. It's ringing with swords and spears and shields, the sounds of battle, and wind. You got the wind blowing. So this is an image of Troy and the Trojan War here. That's an allusion to the battle of the Trojan War. Then Odysseus says, I am part of all that I have met. Yet all experience is an arch wherethrough gleams that untraveled world whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. Okay, Tennyson, this is pretty hard to internalize. This is a metaphor, folks. He's saying that experience is an arch or an archway. Let me get an image up that maybe can help us understand. The line reads, yet all experience is an arch wherethrough gleams the untraveled world, whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. So the idea here is that life is a series of archways. You can look as far forward as the doorway, but you live your life and you arrive at the doorway, and when you look through the doorway, you see another arch ahead of you, and you can only see as far as the arch. And some level, maybe it represents the curve of the earth or the curve of the time as you travel through it. You can't ever arrive at a destination, because every destination, every doorway opens up a new vista with new doorways. It's a pretty cool image that Tennyson's got here, metaphor, if you will. So experience is an arch wherethrough gleams the untraveled world, whose margin fades forever and forever as I move. It's like if you're trying to walk around the world itself, every time you come to a new ridge of mountains, you see a new continent of life before you with another ridge of mountains, and you just keep traversing and traversing and traversing, and that's life. That's our experience of life through the world. It's kind of cool. So he says, how dull it is to pause, to make an end, to rust unburnished, not to shine in use. So he says, I think very clearly here, that he's bored. It's dull living in Ithaca. It's dull doing these things. And this is a metaphor. To rust unburnished, not to shine in use. That's a reference to a sword or a piece of metal. If you leave a piece of metal and you never use it, if you leave a sword and you never use or polish it, it gets rusty. And he feels that he is getting rusty staying in Ithaca as an old man. If you're always using a tool or a sword, it stays shiny. It's shining with use. The rust doesn't happen because the act of using it keeps it new. And he feels like he himself, sitting on his porch or whatever, doing his Ithaca thing, is starting to degrade and rust in comparison to the rest of his life. As though to breathe were life, life piled on life were all too little and of one to me. Little remains, but every hour is saved from that eternal silence. That would be death. So he says, I don't have very much time remaining. So this is Odysseus, I guess, is an old man. But every hour that he's got, he should be spending on something more than being bored, right? From that eternal silence, something more, a bringer of new things. And vile means hateful or bad. It were for some 3 sons. I don't know whether that means 3 years or 3 days. I don't know, to store and hoard myself, and this gray spirit yearning in desire to follow knowledge like a sinking star. That's a simile, beyond the utmost bound of human thought. So Odysseus feels like he wants to explore, he wants to see new things again. He wants to gain new experiences. He wants his old age to be filled with something more than what it is being filled with, in this quote unquote happy ending that Homer left for him, to be home with his wife and family. Um, so then we have a shift of subject, and it's a very short stanza here. But Odysseus turns from his thoughts about himself to thoughts about his son. And you can see him look over and he says, "This is my son, my own Telemachus, to whom I leave the scepter and the isle." So Odysseus is planning to leave. He's going away. And he's giving Telemachus control of the island of Ithaca. "Well loved of me, discerning to fulfill this labor by slow prudence, to make mild a rugged people, and through soft degrees subdue them to the useful and the good." So Telemachus has the patience. Telemachus has the energy, and the ambition to make Ithaca a better place. Odysseus doesn't feel it anymore. Most blameless is he, centered in the sphere of common duties. So as opposed to Odysseus, who is centered in the sphere of uncommon adventures and experiences, Telemachus has always lived his life on Ithaca. All he knows is Ithaca. It's like the guy who stays in his hometown and is a really useful and meaningful member of that hometown community versus the one who wants to be a world traveler. Odysseus is the world traveler type. Telemachus is the I'm going to stay home and make a difference type. Let's see, in offices of tenderness, of common duties, decent not to fail in offices of tenderness, and pay meet adoration to my household God. So he's also very pious, and he's going to, treat all the people of Ithaca well and respect the gods and all those things. He works his work and I mine. So Odysseus's work is to travel. Telemachus's work is to run the country. So that's it. He spends a few thoughts on Telemachus. Then he goes back to himself and how he wants his time to end. And this is probably the most important stanza of the poem. We're already at 36 minutes, so I'll try and keep it brief, but you know me. There lies the port. So Odysseus is getting ready to leave. The vessel puffs her sail. There gloom the dark, broad seas. My mariners, souls that have toiled and wrought and thought with me, that ever with a frolic welcome took the thunder and the sunshine, and opposed free hearts, free foreheads. You and I are old. So now he's talking not to you, the reader, but to his sailors, the ones who accompanied him on his journey back from Troy. Now you're all like, wait, I thought they were all dead. They are, and this gets complicated, and we'll talk about it in a second. But let's read it on the surface first, and then try and interpret it a little bit deeper on some sort of an allegorical level second, because I think it bears both readings. Remember, an allegory is a story that has two levels of meaning: a surface level and a symbolic level. And right now, we're going to stay on the surface level so that we can understand what's going on in the poem. So there lies the port. The vessel puffs her sails. So this is Odysseus's ship. You can see the wind blowing in the sails. There gloom the dark, broad seas. The ocean is waiting for him to explore. My mariners, these are his sailors, souls that have toiled and wrought and thought with me, that ever with a frolic welcome took the thunder and the sunshine, and opposed free hearts, free foreheads. You and I are old. So he's making a speech to his sailors. You and I are old. We're all old men. Old age has yet his honor and his toil. Death closes all, but something before the end. Some work of noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming men that strove with gods. So what he says to his sailors is like, look, I know we're old, but it doesn't mean we have to be pointless. It doesn't mean that our life is done. Look who we were. We were men that strove with gods. We did all these amazing things. Why should we just rust away and waste away to nothing? Let's do something worthwhile still. It's a stirring speech. And honestly, it moves me. I think about my father and my grandfather and the idea of retirement that we're all working towards. Everybody who's in a job working to try and retire. What happens then? What do you do? Is it just relax for the rest of your life? Is that what you want your life to be? Odysseus doesn't think so. The lights begin to twinkle from the rocks. So the sun is setting in this image. The long day wanes, the slow moon climbs, the deep moans round with many voices. They can hear voices coming out of the sea. Come, my friends. He's still talking to his sailors. It is not too late to seek a newer world. Push off and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows. Those are the oars hitting the water and pushing them farther and farther out to sea. For my purpose holds, now he tells you what his plan is, to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. Now remember, if you lived in ancient Greece and didn't know that the world was round and thought the world was flat, there would be a place where the sun bathes into the ocean, and he's going to sail beyond the sunset. He's going to sail west until he gets past Helios's palace, where the sun sets into the ocean, where all the stars set into the ocean, and see what's on the other side of that. So he says, to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. They may drown. It may well be that we shall touch the happy isles. This is some sort of image of the Elysian fields or heaven, and see the great Achilles whom we knew, so that traveled to the place where the great heroes live after their death. Then he says, though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. So he's like, look, we're old. We're not what we used to be. It's true. It's true. We've lost a lot of strength. We've lost a lot of health. But much abides. The memories, the soul, the person who I was, I still am in my old age. And you want to think about this. I think a lot of times if you see an old person, especially say a military vet or something like that, and you think about the experiences that they've had, and this is where this poem is starting to bridge into something else. And we can talk about that. There were definitely military vets in England, and I think that this poem is sort of about them. So hold your thought on that. It's kind of like that Icarus poem we read. You remember the poem Icarus by Henry Field? Anyway, though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will. Your body gets weaker, your will does not. At the end, he says to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. And so his whole speech at the end is to explore, to go see what's beyond the sunset. And he and his men leave on the ship and never come back. And this ties right into the Odyssey, because in the Odyssey, what's promised to Odysseus is a mild death at sea, as soft as his wife's hand. And this is him going off to I guess, explore. And you can imagine that this is what's coming, is he's going to have that death. It ties in also with Dante and his interpretation of what happens at the end of Odysseus's life, that he goes sailing west as far as he can, and then dies at sea. So all of this makes sense, but these lines, I think, are allegorical. I think it's more than what it seems like on the surface. On the surface, he makes a speech to his sailors, gets on a boat, and sails off. Let's read it on a secondary level. There lies the port, the vessel puffs her sail, there gloom, look at this word gloom, the dark broad seas. My mariners, souls that have toiled and wrought and thought. When you get the word souls there, remember, all of Odysseus's men are dead. I'm just going to throw out here the theory that this final voyage is actually Odysseus dying. Maybe it's a metaphor. Maybe it's symbolic. It's an allegory, right? The ship is the passage from life to death. Odysseus is dying in Ithaca of old age, many years later, and his death is being played in his mind as a voyage on the ship, because the ship is populated by the souls of all his fallen comrades. Right? We got the word souls here. So his soul is boarding the ship, and the crossing that he's taking is maybe a crossing of death, and there's a lot of evidence to represent that. Let's see. Death closes all, but something ere the end, some work of noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming men that strove with gods. The lights begin to twinkle from the rocks, the long day wanes. Well, if the day is metaphoric for life, then night is death. Sunset often represents death in poetry. And here's the sun setting as Odysseus boards the ship, right? The long day wanes, a slow moon climbs, a deep moans round with many voices. That was a weird line before, but if it's the sound of the souls of the dead welcoming Odysseus to join them. Maybe that's what's going on here. Come, my friends, it's not too late to seek a newer world. Perhaps this newer world, whoa, I don't know why I just did that. Perhaps this newer world is the, I guess metaphorically Shakespeare called it the undiscovered country, death, the place that we all go to explore at the end of our lives, right? And so they're all going to sail out beyond the sunset. If the sunset represents literal death, then sailing beyond it is what the world that comes beyond your own death, right? So there's something going on here. And seeing Achilles is dead, so that makes sense as well. So this idea that Odysseus is accepting his death and viewing it as the last great voyage of his life, I think makes this whole second bit allegorical, and powerful. So I just wanted to throw that out there. So let's talk also, if we're looking at allegories, if we're looking at what this poem's really about. I mean, clearly it's a poem about Odysseus facing the end of his life or facing the last years of his life, and this idea that he doesn't want to rust unburnished, that he doesn't want to just become old and pointless. He was such an important figure in his life, and the idea that he's just going to sit on his porch and do nothing for the rest of his life bothers him, especially considering the contrast with how he lived. And so he's going to go off and do something meaningful. Maybe this poem is about soldiers. I mean, this is a Victorian society. The Victorians were busy conquering the world, like Ulysses, like Odysseus. British soldiers had traveled everywhere: South Africa, India, the Middle East, Australia, and they conquered all kinds of, indigenous civilizations. The British Empire has a very mixed legacy, as we've talked about in previous videos. But these soldiers who are world travelers, who have been all over the world and seen all of these things, once they get discharged from the military, once they get too old to participate anymore, they're just expected to go home and live their regular life in retirement on pension or whatever, and go, I guess, quietly into the night. And maybe this poem is about them as well, sort of a lamentation of the contrast between the life that they had lived and the life that now they are living, sitting on a cottage steps in Pembroke or someplace in England. I don't know. I think that's something to think about. And this poem has also been linked a little bit, I think, to some PTSD and some of those ideas that people who have been through really difficult and challenging life experiences then want. They become used to the stress and the difficulty, and maybe Odysseus is going through that as well, and so it's difficult for him to transition from a life of stress where everything's a life or death decision to a life of ease in Ithaca. I think that's worth noting too. Anyway, I'm going to shut up. I'm just going to read it one more time from beginning to end. Just listen and appreciate the poem for what it is, and then I'll call this lecture done without any more analysis. Ulysses by Alfred Lord Tennyson. It little profits that an idle king by this still hearth among these barren crags, matched with an aged wife, I mete and dole unequal laws unto a savage race that hoard and sleep and feed and know not me. I cannot rest from travel. I will drink life to the lees. All times I have enjoyed greatly, have suffered greatly, both with those that loved me and alone on shore, and when through the scudding drifts the rainy Hyades vexed the dim sea. I am become a name, for always roaming with a hungry heart. Much have I seen and known, cities of men and manners, climates, councils, governments, myself not least, but honored of them all, and drunk delight of battle with my peers far on the ringing plains of windy Troy. I am a part of all I have met. Yet all experience is an arch, wherethrough gleams that untraveled world whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. How dull it is to pause, to make an end, to rust unburnished, not to shine in use, as though to breathe were life, life piled on life were all too little, and of one to me little remains, but every hour is saved from that eternal silence, something more, a bringer of new things. And vile it were for some 3 suns to store and hoard myself, and this gray spirit yearning and desire to follow knowledge like a sinking star, beyond the utmost bound of human thought. This is my son, my own Telemachus, to whom I leave the sceptre and the isle, well loved of me, discerning to fulfill this labor, by slow prudence to make mild a rugged people, and through soft degrees subdue them to the useful and the good. Most blameless is he, centered in the sphere of common duties, decent not to fail in offices of tenderness, and pay meet adoration to my household gods when I am gone. He works his work, I mine. There lies the port. The vessel puffs her sail. There gloom the dark, broad seas. My mariners, souls that have toiled and wrought and thought with me, that ever with a frolic welcome took the thunder and the sunshine, and opposed free hearts, free foreheads. You and I are old. Old age has yet his honor and his toil. Death closes all, but something ere the end. Some work of noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming men that strove with gods. The lights begin to twinkle from the rocks. The long day wanes, the slow moon climbs, the deep moans round with many voices. Come, my friends, it is not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order smite the sounding furrows, for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be that we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield.